Friends, it's my honor to introduce to you Dr. Diana Butler Bass. I suspect that most of you are here today because you know Diana. You've read one or two or more of her 11 books. You've seen her on national news outlets, or you've heard her speak at conferences. Therefore, I will not give you the traditional introduction of Dr. Bass. You can read that for yourself in your lecture program. Instead, I want to tell you about 2 times that I have met Diana. And I'm putting met in quotes because we didn't actually meet. And 2, she would have no reason to remember these interactions, but they were important to me. The first time I encountered Diana was in 2009 or 10 when she came to speak at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, where I was a doctoral student. She was one of the keynote speakers alongside Brian McLaren and the late, great, beautiful Marcus Borg.
That was a great event.
It was wonderful. It was an incredible conference, and in her lecture, Diana introduced to me the language of generative faith. That is, a focus upon God's ability to give birth and new life within us and within our communities of faith. Now, I know we in mainline Protestantism shy away from that born-again language, but that evening Diana encouraged us to embrace it. And since that epiphanic moment, I have sought to build my pastoral ministry on encouraging the church to ask herself that most fundamentally important question: what does new life look like for us? What might give birth to a new understanding of worship, a new understanding of Christ, a new understanding of even ourselves? And if we truly believe in Easter, what might even need to die in order that God might raise up something new? The second time I encountered Diana was, and I don't believe she knows this, but when in a column I wrote, I gently pushed back on something that she had written. I'm not going to tell you what the disagreement was because A, it isn't that important, and B, I've now changed my mind, and I think she was right all along. But in doing so, the editor of the journal tagged Diana in posting my article, something I had intentionally not wanted to do. But Diana responded like this, and I'll never forget it. She said, "I hear you. I stand by what I said, but I hear you." And I thought to myself, where am I? Is this social media? And we're being kind and gracious with one another. I've come to learn that that's just who Diana is. She is kind and she is gracious. She is also brilliant and thoughtful and creative, and she deeply loves the church. And in her writing and in her preaching, I believe she wants us to embrace the new life we might experience when we open ourselves, truly open ourselves to new understandings of God, of the church, and of ourselves. Thank you for being here. Friends, will you join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Butler Bass?
Oh my gosh. Whew, I'm glad that was one of my better days on Twitter. Whoa, what a pleasure to be here for a church anniversary. I actually love anniversaries and birthday celebrations of all sorts. I had my lunch, however, in the pastor's office by myself, so if there was cake, if somebody can smuggle me a piece, I'd be really happy for that. Excuse me. The other thing that I'm happy about today is not just that it's an anniversary, but it gives me today gives me a chance to talk about 2 of my favorite subjects. This morning I preached about gratitude, which is something I love to talk about, and this afternoon I'm preaching about history, which is something I have loved since I was a child. The remarks of my talk this afternoon are entitled, "The Spiritual Practice of Honestly Engaging Our Past to Live into Our Future." And that's a long way of saying, I'm just going to talk about history. Now, if any of you have one of those, sort of online accounts, my account, here I'm talking about my account with United Airlines, for some reason, every time I sign into that United account, it doesn't recognize my computer. And so I'm endlessly being asked by United the same two questions to prove who I am. You know, how you have answers to particular questions. I won't tell you what one of those questions is, but the other question is, what was your least favorite subject in school? And my answer is math. One day I was on the phone with someone from United because I had gotten locked out of my account, and instead of just the computer asking me that question, what was your least favorite subject in school, it was a real human being on the other end of a telephone. And so she said, what was it? And I said, math. And she laughed, and I said, I bet you hear that a lot. She said, yeah, there's only one other answer I hear nearly quite that much, and that's history. And I said, are you kidding me? I take that personally. Because, as I mentioned a moment ago, I have always loved history. I have loved it since I was a little girl checking out library books at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore City in the 1960s on things like ancient Mexican archaeology and Egyptian pyramids. And it is fascinating to me that part, I think, of my love for Christianity is that history is important to our faith. That we do talk about a God who was born into human history, that we have a faith that marks time, daily time, seasonal time, year after year after year. History is so central to what it means to be a Christian. So when I was coming into young adulthood and attending college, I happened to go to a Christian college in California that required 4 religious studies classes of every one of its graduates. And the one I could not wait to get to was the church history class. I walked in, sat down, the professor came in and started lecturing, and immediately I was hooked. I said to a friend of mine after the class, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life, which is a pretty geeky thing to say when you're 19 years old. I want to grow up and be a church historian. But that's who I am. And that's one of the things that I love. Now, why is it that some people hate history? And why is it that other people sort of gravitate towards it? Well, I think that part of the dislike and also part of the excitement of history is wrapped up in the fact that history isn't just about one thing. People who think history is dull tend to think that history is little more than information about the past. And in that sense, I mean, it's about memorization of timelines and dates and all those things that you had to, have in your brain in order to pass some test. Facts, chronologies, events. And history is about that. It is about the facts of the past. But it is also about something else. And that is, how do we interpret those facts of the past to live now and make choices about the future? So history is both information about and it's the interpretation of. And in that second category, the interpretation of, historians assemble evidence. We think about things like, whose account is the most trustworthy of all of the accounts that are in front of us about a particular event? How do we account for multiple perspectives? What characters do we choose to include in the writing of the larger story? This one is a really important question. What lens do we bring to this data? Are we looking at something that's primarily an economically driven issue, a politically driven event, something that involves institutions? Is this about social history? What is this all about? And so I was trained as a historian of religion. And that means that when I go and look at issues, events, and concerns of history, the first lens that I have on is a lens about faith. How in the world do people of different religious traditions see the moment in which they live? How do they make choices? And so very typical kinds of things that I talked about, say, 30 years ago in graduate school, were the role of religion in the American Revolutionary War. And that's not something social historians or economic historians are generally very interested in. But it is a thing that historians of religion are concerned about. Now, that is a really helpful little framework to start understanding my theme, how we deal honestly with engaging our past. Because honesty comes in both of those arenas. Honesty comes in the actual dealing with evidence of the things that happened a long time ago, and honesty has to come in our interpretations. Are we being really fair to the people of the past? Are we bringing the right voices forward in good measure in order to treat the past as it deserves to be treated? There's a lot of questions about honesty and history. And it is something that every single historian has to balance and learn to live into. The information side of this equation is that the facts of history, I say this very sort of lightly, are a bit more what we might consider to be static. You can look back and see someone's birth certificate and understand it was a particular year they were born. Or you can see the date of a certain event, when a war started and when a war ended. So there's a kind of a framework of factuality that has a relative stasis to it. And the information about history generally only changes when we have new discoveries. And one of the things that's been so exciting in recent years, for example, in the history of early Christianity, is that we have had so many new discoveries of ancient texts. There's been real improvement in how archaeology is done and how we can gather up new data. I have this wonderful friend who's a PhD student right now at Duke University, and she's working on the scholarship of John's Gospel and Mary Magdalene. And one of the things that is just thrilling is that she has discovered new information about the Gospel of John. Wow. You know, we thought we knew all there was to know. But literally, by using different kinds of computer-generated analysis and digitized text, she's been able to figure out that there is something we formerly did not know. We have new evidence of a case. Now, in that area of information, there is often less controversy about the nature of history, because you have to be honest about the data. You're not allowed to just make stuff up if you're a historian. Historians that do that do not get tenure. And it is very bad for your career. There are historians who have done it, and nothing ever turns out well for them. So we're trained very carefully to be honest about the evidence that we have in front of us, and even humble about it. One of the things that historians learn, and this I think has to do a lot about spiritual practice, is that we have to live in a sort of relationship of humility with facts. Is that you're not allowed to change stuff. There is stuff in the universe that's true, and that you have to take that as it is. You're not allowed to press yourself over that information. So that's part of it. And then the other piece, interpretation, this is where things get a little more fun. Interpretation changes all the time. I've often thought about writing a book with a chapter called History Changes. Because the way we interpret that data is different in successive generations of historians. Because we're looking at the same set of facts under new cultural conditions. This is, of course, one of the things that's happening right now in our culture, is that there are more people of color, for example, who have gone to graduate school, more people of color who are looking at text. There are more women who are looking at text than ever before, hence my friend, for example, working on John and Mary Magdalene. No woman had ever examined the particular text in which she found new information about the Gospel of John. And she looks at it, and it was just as obvious as could be to her. And so the more different sets of eyes, the more cultural experiences you bring to a set of facts, well, that can change pretty radically the interpretation of something that seemed to have been a given. And not only does history change in the sense that it changes, the interpretations of it change with the changing cultural context, but that it's the act of interpreting history that gives us a sense of meaning, purpose, and identity as individuals and as communities. And that is where it gets a little more difficult. What does it mean to be honest about the meaning we derive from the data? What does it mean to be honest about the meaning we derive from the data? Well, this is the area right now where there is an enormous amount of controversy. Indeed, when I was in seminary many years ago, in the mid-1980s, I went to a place called Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, north of Boston. It's an evangelical seminary. And at the time, Gordon Conwell was in a state of intense conflict between sort of the more open-ended, culturally, we'll use an old-fashioned word here, culturally sort of hip and open evangelicals that were mostly charismatics, Pentecostals, and some liberal Protestants that had somehow or another gotten to Gordon Conwell, and a group of neo-Calvinists who were fundamentalists. And I know there's going to be some people in this audience here who will be familiar with the fact that that kind of neo-Calvinism had an intense impact on Baptist life in the 1980s. And so there was this big crisis at the seminary between these two groups of people. And what happened was most of the theologians were the neo-Calvinists, and most of the New Testament professors were the open, generous, generative, more liberal in context people. And the theologians, really full of their own sense of power and correctness, I guess, started a crusade against the New Testament department. And so people got fired, people's livelihoods were threatened. Once they got rid of the New Testament professors they didn't like, they turned on the social ethicists, and then they started turning on the pastoral theology department, because real theology, systematic theology, is always so much purer than those messy pastoral theologians sitting over there in that corner. And they wanted to purify the seminary. And so I watched this happen as a student, and my one thought was, it's not safe to either be a theologian or a New Testament scholar. And I love history anyway, and so I want to just study history because it's safe. Yeah, thank you so much. Because that's the thing that only a 24-year-old can probably say. So I went off to graduate school thinking I was going to the safe part of studying about religion. Well, what we know now, of course, and we see it every day in every newspaper across the United States, is that history is not safe. I literally just did an online event with some nice people in Florida, and when I made some joke about history being safe, they all just groaned. Because history has become one of the battle lines for politics in Florida. We know here in Richmond, Virginia, I live in Alexandria, we know here how history, the telling of history, the interpretation of history, is part of a cultural battle line. And we have all seen over the last couple years political campaigns that have stood really on issues of history, protesting the way that history is taught in schools on one side or the other. One of the most interesting examples we have about in this sort of understanding of information about an event and interpretation of an event is, of course, the 1619 Project. There is no historical question that in 1619, the very first black people came from Africa who were in transit, being held as slaves. They were enslaved in transit going to South America, no question about that. And they got diverted here to Virginia. And so the first enslaved people arrived right here in our neighborhood in 1619. Now, that's a fact. How do we interpret that? How do we interpret that? Well, some really interesting historians have said the way we interpret that is thinking about American history, not beginning with Plymouth Rock in 1620, but beginning with this episode in Jamestown in 1619. And then they wrote articles and a book and a children's curriculum and all kinds of stuff with that interpretation of those facts about how slavery and enslavement was key to understanding the economic, political life of what becomes the United States. Now, there are historians that disagreed with that. And many people growing up, when they first heard this interpretation, American history began in 1619, stopped and said, well, wait a second, I thought American history began in 1776. That's what I was taught in school. And so there becomes, for people, confusion and curiosity and wondering, how did history change? Well, that's how history changes. History changes when cultural context makes facts that are accepted facts look different. And we have to begin the process of telling a new story and arguing about a new story before a sort of more holistic sense of meaning arises within that new cultural context. So it's a really interesting moment for historians to see something we usually do in private, having fights at the American Historical Association about a bunch of data, and people whose interpretations seem kind of, okay, that's interesting, never thought about it that way before, tell me more. That's the work we did in private, and now we're doing it in public. And now, not only are we doing it in public, but it's become public flashpoint. So how are we how do we tell that part honestly about what is going on in the interpretation of data, in the interpretation of historical evidence? Well, I want to share with you a personal story about this, because I think that one of the things that we shouldn't do, and it's great to talk about a church anniversary in this regard. One of the things I have learned over the years, and I have not looked at all at the church history you produced, but one of the things I have learned is that many locally produced parish histories of individual congregations often read like a chronicle of saints. You know, you put out all the really good things that happened, all the successful sorts of capital campaigns, how big the Sunday school was. So the histories of congregations are often an example of triumphal history. I was a member for many years of a church in Santa Barbara, California called Trinity Episcopal Church. And I did a lot of interviews with people because it was a church that went through a big period of change and a time of intense congregational renewal. And I was curious about the history of the church to figure out how the history of it linked up with what was going on in the congregation while I was a member. And so someone gave me the parish history, what little there was. It was not a very good parish history. I sort of searched around in the records of the Santa Barbara News Press, found a little bit more. And then while I was interviewing people to talk about history, folks who had longer memories of the congregation, I said, well, you know, it seems like this has always been a congregation that got along pretty well. And there was a man in the interview group who was in his 90s. And he said, well, if you don't count that time that the vestry had a fist fight. And I went, what? And lo and behold, he sort of unpacks this story about how they got really angry one point in time about the future of the church. And these two gentlemen who were still part of the congregation, as a matter of fact, I knew them, they both sat together in the front pew. They were both widowers, so their wives had passed away. They seemed like they were best friends. Well, one of them had hit the other guy so hard in this vestry meeting that they had to call out an ambulance to come and collect this guy from the vestry meeting and take him to the hospital. And so that's not the kind of thing that generally shows up in the parish history. But that's what it means to be human, to live in community and live in time together and to be fighting over what the future is about and how congregational life, how a life together gives us a sense of meaning, purpose, and identity. Sometimes it gets contentious. We fight over history. And because of the fighting that I think we know is all just inherent in history making, because we want to be nice Christians, we tend not to often be entirely honest about our own interpretations of history. We mute them in favor of niceness. Now, we mute them because we want to be nice to our ancestors who came before, or we understand in some way, shape, or form that our identity is wrapped up in the way that story is told. And maybe it threatens us. Maybe something about the past does not really speak to our benefit today. And so we sort of push those things in the corner, or we hide them. I would like to suggest that honesty, however, is about enlarging the story, telling a more human story, a more fulsome story. And as we do that, we begin to be able to see ourselves differently and often more clearly. And so the personal story that I want to tell. In the summer of 2010, my mother had passed away. And a few weeks later, my husband Richard and I just decided, we dropped our daughter off at camp and we decided that we needed to get away. And so we went out to the eastern shore of Maryland, stayed at that nice resort hotel out there in Cambridge, Maryland, and just sort of cooled our souls by the pool. And one day, I looked at Richard and I said, you know, I don't really think I just want to sit by the pool today. Can we just go on a little history tour of the Eastern Shore? There are things I really want to see. And so I downloaded a list of historic sites from the internet, different buildings that the state of Maryland has deemed historically important. And we got in the car and we started driving. And much of that tour follows the trail that is now the Harriet Tubman Trail, which is I highly recommend if you have not already done it. But this was before that trail was fully sort of put forth to the public. But there were a lot of sites on it that are now on that trail. Along the way, we came to this meeting house, Quaker meeting house outside of Easton, Maryland. And when I looked at the list, I said, oh, this could be exciting, because it says that this meeting house was built in 1682, making it one of the oldest continuous use church buildings in the United States. There are only like 3, 4, or 5 church buildings that this has any contention for being as old as the Third Haven Quaker Meeting House in Easton, Maryland. And so my husband and I got very excited. He actually wrote a bachelor's thesis for Wesleyan University on colonial architecture, and so he was very excited about this too. And we pulled into the driveway for the meeting house. And when you pull into the driveway, which is south of the town of Easton, you go through these old brick walls, and you find yourself on this little winding driveway surrounded by very ancient oak trees. And I felt my heart pumping more. We turned the corner of the driveway, and there were 3 buildings: a caretaker's cottage, the new church built in 1882, and the meeting house. And the meeting house was clearly old. Before the car even stopped, I believe that I had jumped out and was running up the stairs. And you could see the wavy glass in the windows. You had to pull on a rope in order to pull the latch up on the inside of the door, and the door would swing open, revealing this interior of all unpainted wood. I'd find out from the little guide to the building that the last time that the church was renovated was 1720. So this is a very pristine church building. As we walked around inside of the church building, I fell into an appropriate kind of Quaker silence. And my husband said, "You aren't usually this quiet. What are you thinking?" And I looked at him, and I got all choked up, and I said, "I feel like I've been here before." He replied, "Well, that's odd, because you haven't been." And so we stayed for about another half an hour just drinking in this rich spiritual space, this ancient, this ancient silence. And I would never forget that building. A few years later, I was working on a book called Grounded. And the question at the center of that book is, what grounds me in this world? How do I find a sense of my identity? I'm a person that's lived in lots of different places. I'm not like one of those writers who gets a reputation for being a Midwestern writer or a California writer or something like that. I'm a sort of non-geographical, all over the map writer. And it's because I didn't know much about where I really came from. My family grew up pretty poor, and one of the things that is true about our culture is that poor white people have very poor records kept about their families over time. And so, particularly my mother's family was lost in the midst of bad record keeping and poverty. I did not know who she was and did not know who I was from her line. Well, so I'm working on this project, and one of the things I did was sign up for Ancestry.com. And over the years I had watched this just to try to get a sense of anybody filling in things with my family history. So I signed in this one day, and I got one of those little green leaves, and I went over and I looked, and lo and behold, somebody had filled in my mother's family tree. I could not believe it. And I immediately, I was panting with anxiety as I went over to start following it back. And it was like, there was my mother, there was her father, who I knew that, and then his mother and father, who I had their names. And I never knew anything beyond that. And then there was someone before them, and someone before them. It went back through the 1800s, or through the 1900s. It went back into the 1800s. It went back before the Revolutionary War. I could not believe how old this was getting. And finally, it landed on a name of the very first person in my mother's father's patriarchal line to have come to what eventually would become the United States. It was a fellow by the name of Andrew Orme, who came from Scotland. He was born in Scotland in 1652, and by the year 1678, he was in Maryland. And why do I know he was in Maryland by 1678? Because his marriage record was there, his baptism record and his marriage record. And so I looked at the baptismal record for this little tiny town in a parish church in Scotland, and then I looked at the marriage record in Maryland, and it said, Andrew Orme married Eleanor Morris at the Third Haven Quaker Meeting House in Easton, Maryland in 1678. I knew nothing about Quakers or Scotland or any of this having anything to do with my own family history. What I did know is that my maiden name, surprise, is actually Hochstead. I've been married twice, so Butler and Bass. Those are not my actual names. Hochsteds were incredibly recent German immigrants. My family was incredibly patriarchal. People sometimes would ask me, my friends mostly, where did you grow up? And I'd say, I grew up in 19th century Germany. My grandfather still spoke a form of rump German around our family tables on Sunday afternoon meals. We frequently had to sit through lectures about how Hitler was so poorly misunderstood. And so that was the family that I knew growing up. Now, my mother, who was not much liked by her in-laws, my mother was a fan of Dr. King's. My mother had refused to protest when the schools in Baltimore City were integrated in 1957. My mother taught me that all people had to be treated with dignity and equality, and that no person should ever be judged by the color of their skin. She's just a classic. My mom was great. She was a feminist. My mother was always fighting for someone's rights, She always talked about how the poor deserved all of our help. There was no undeserving poor person anywhere near our house. So here's my mother, who has all these views about equality and justice and all this sort of stuff, and there's my dad's family. And I knew that somehow I was taking after my mother, but it was like, how did she get that way? And lo and behold, what do the Quakers believe? The Quakers believe that every person has the inner light. The Quakers were the first white European people to protest against enslavement. The Quakers were just remarkable. And I found out in 2013 that I was actually a Quaker and not a German. I gotta tell you, it was the most exciting thing I ever heard about my own life. I knew something about myself that I had known was always true. Where I got it, it was not an importation, that I cared about justice, that I really believed that people are fully equal, that I care about liberation. All that stuff, it was my spiritual DNA. It was actually my birthright. I was so excited. And so I found out something about myself. And then I thought to myself, why didn't I know this? Why didn't anybody save this? Why did this get lost? And so what I should have probably done was stop there. But because I'm a historian, I couldn't. And so I kept pressing in, looking for more information about my family. And that's when I discovered that Andrew Orme, by 1699, was in trouble with the Quakers. And what it appears to be, I have not been able to quite historically prove this yet, but the suggestive evidence is all around. It appears that Third Haven Quaker Meeting House was the site of one of the oldest congregational arguments about enslavement in the colonies. We had thought before this that the oldest sort of texts written in Quaker tradition in the United States by any white European person protesting against slavery were written in the 1740s. But in the last 15 years, there's been discovered that in this little Quaker meeting house in Easton, Maryland, there was actually the very first ever anti-slavery tract written by a white person. And that means that my ancestor went to a Quaker meeting where in the 1690s, this was a lively issue. There were people who were really fighting in their meeting about enslavement. And so, Andrew Orme, in 1699, he dies, and he was in trouble with the Quakers. I have records of the Quakers coming to him and telling him to repent. They forget to say of what. But then I got Andrew Orme's will. And the first thing that's listed at the top of his will is, I leave to my heirs my 3 servants. And there were unnamed 3 people and what they were worth. Andrew Orme was a bad Quaker. And I wonder about that. I wonder if that's one of the things that his family wanted to cover up, because it's clear that they have a fight about this after he dies, that it continues on. His widow seems to inherit the 3 people from his will, and she had also been part of this Quaker meeting. The Quakers start coming to her and telling her to repent, until finally she leaves the Quaker meeting altogether and she becomes an Anglican. because nobody bothers Anglicans about owning slaves. And that's the honest history of my family. There were fights about the worst social issue in the United States, that they were admirable. They were Quakers. They believed in the inner light. They believed in justice, and yet they couldn't see the injustice that they were participating in. They were collaborators. They were bad Quakers. They became good Episcopalians. Which is really a terrible thing to say, because I am a good Episcopalian, and really that's not the way it goes right now. But that's what it is. So what do I do with a story like that? What do any of us do with a story like that? Because you know what? We all have stories like that. We let all of the evidence speak. We face without fear the full story. And what that does is it reminds me that all of the people whose DNA and whose life experiences and whose perspectives on the world, all of those people whose lives created mine, are part of a deeply complex inheritance that I have. It helps me explain many of the things that I did not know about myself. Where do I get this crazy sense of justice in this hierarchical, closed, and bigoted world? Well, it came from somewhere. It came from my mother. It came from the fact that she had some Quaker energy, despite the fact she never knew she was a Quaker. And when you get to that complexity and you see it for what it is, this is the best part. We each get to choose how we write history going forward. I choose here, in front of you and with you all, not to be a collaborator. I choose to lift up the idea that every single person has the inner light of God within. I choose a future of human solidarity where there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but we are all one. I get to choose. And in that choosing, I know that I have both heroes in the line that has led me here, and I have people who failed to choose well. And in choosing differently, it's not an insult for Andrew Orme. I don't know why he made the choices he did. I just wish he hadn't. But I get to correct his past choices by making a better choice for the future. And that, my friends, is what I think honesty about interpretation is all about. Is recognizing the whole story and making better choices. To me, that seems like a spiritual practice. That kind of honesty, that kind of engagement with time, and recognizing both the beauty of our inheritance and how we have all been dogged through time by demons that have undone the dream of God's beauty for the whole of humankind. I choose to do better. If we can engage history that way, I can't promise you it will be less contentious. It is always contentious. History can hurt. But it does really remind us that with every action and every choice we make here and now, we are writing a story that someone will discover in another 100 years And I always ask people, what do you want those folks to find out about you? Think about it. What story are you writing that will be discovered a century hence? That's a story for us as individuals, and it's a story for us as communities. And so I welcome you, those of you who might not like history, who have that as your united security question, that history as both information and interpretation is actually one of the pathways to a deeper sense of identity, knowing who you are and what the purpose for which God has created you. And as it is that for us as individuals, it is also that for us as communities. Individual congregations and communities like Richmond, Virginia, communities like the Great Commonwealth of Virginia, and communities like the United States of America. Let's keep fighting over history, but let's do it fair. And let's be able to tell stories with real meaning and energy and hope for the future in the public square. So welcome to being historians of the future. Thank you.
An answer, and so if you have any questions, I'd like to bring the microphone to you and have you ask that for all of us. Any questions?
Someone will. Someone always does.
Okay.
Except if I'm in Canada, which I haven't been up there for a couple years, but the Canadians are always so quiet.
All right, good evening. I'm so grateful to hear everything you're saying, especially your notion of like the need for honesty in history telling. It makes you think about the old adage, like, what about the half that hasn't been told? And I guess my question is really, how do we accomplish this when not everyone is necessarily operating in good faith, where, you know, you're talking with this like sincere desire to discover the history and tell the story, and regardless of what the story may be, you want to tell the whole story. How do we do that in a society where that's so heavily discouraged and even penalized for like telling that sort of truth?
Yeah, thank you so much. There are lots of people being penalized for telling honest stories right now. I said that I was just on a thing in Florida, and they had stories about that. And so I think that one of the things, first of all, I recognize is not every actor in this scenario is a good faith actor. And that has always been the case about the writing of history. There have always been really bad faith actors, especially in church history. Usually in church history, when you wanted to cover somebody up or something up, you burned the person at the stake, or you excommunicated them, or something horrible like that, in order to keep them from telling their truth. And so the idea of lying and not being a good actor isn't just a problem of our time. It's deep within the history of Western culture, and it's deep within Western Christianity. So in that sense, I just already know that that's there. You know, I sort of take that as a given. There are always going to be people who are trying to silence stories that widen our field of vision, that are stories that challenge the status quo, that are stories that go against institutions that hold power. So that's just going to happen, and that's certainly what's happening right now, as you well know. So how do we do that? I just think you get loud. You just keep taking up public storytelling space. You just keep telling your story. One of the things that I love telling this story about my family is that there are so many white people who are utterly terrified to tell the story about slaveholders in their own families. And so for a person like myself to just be able to stand up in a room with a lot of white people in it and tell a story like this in a perfectly natural way, telling both sides of it, the full story, that unhinges some level of the fear among white people. And it also teaches people, pedagogically, one of the things I'm doing is trying to teach people that you don't have to be afraid of the ugly side of the story, because that's where the silencing comes from. That's where you're either trying to hide that because you think it's ugly, or someone has more nefarious purposes to try to hide that because you feel like you're going to lose something, power, privilege, whatever. And so I just think that the more, certainly white folk can stand in a place and tell honest stories, the further we're going to get ahead with this. It's very powerful. And that, of course, also means that those honest stories open up a new table of storytelling that lots of more people feel comfortable at. And so we just keep pursuing that together. And I can't think of any other way to do it except, please consider historians as you vote. History teachers and all the people who have the really hard job of trying to tell a good and honest story for our time that helps us to move ahead as a democracy. Those people really need backing from all of us. So there are political things we can do as well. So that's kind of the way I approach it. I think about the fact that stories are always controversial. Christianity has a horrible history of covering up stories it doesn't like. Be loud. For my white brothers and sisters, don't be afraid of the whole story, for gosh sake. It's just actually burying the story is far worse than telling it. And then let's all have dinner together and tell all of our stories and see where that takes us. So that's my hope. And as you do that, my generous hope is you create more and more people of goodwill. And that slowly begins to unhinge the fear of the powerful institutions and the people who are threatening the telling of a more honest history in the public square. I'm curious, are you a historian or are you a professor or something? You were smiling a lot when I was talking about sort of academic stuff, and so I was just wondering.
So, like a lot of what you're saying, I was like just taking notes back here, but I appreciate it.
You have a professorial look.
When you were in the meat house and you felt that you had been there before, and then you found that your ancestors were members of the meeting house, does that have a meaning to you?
Does that have meaning to me?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh my gosh. I mean, really, when I figured out that was my family, the moment I saw the words Third Haven Meeting House on the wedding, like the certificate or whatever, the marriage license, I screamed out loud, and my husband ran across the house, and I'm pointing at the screen, and he looks down, and he goes, your ancestors are from there? And I said, oh, yes. And so the meaning that it holds for me is, I am of the opinion that the whole universe we live in is much more mysterious than we ever think of it. So I love facts and data and evidence and all that stuff in history, but I also think that we live in a universe that's constantly speaking towards us and trying to reveal deeper connections than we see with our regular senses. And people say that I'm a very intuitive person, and so it's just part of who I am. And I'm always sort of running into very spooky connections, and there are lots of them. I write about some of them in different books that I've written. Sometimes I write about them in a newsletter. I can guarantee you that the stories that I tell about these things are 100% true, and that my husband and daughter will testify to the fact that that these weird things happen to Mom all the time. So for me, it's part of who I am to sort of run into these very strange connections and let those connections startle me and surprise me and rearrange my sort of spiritual, theological, and mental universe. And I'm always open to those things occurring. So one of the extended stories out of that whole thing is, I guess, I don't remember what year this was. It's probably 2015. There might be somebody here from St. Stephen's here in Richmond who used to have John Philip Newell come a lot to their congregation. And so there was this one summer when I noticed, I'd gotten some email from someone down here at St. Stephen's, and it said that John Philip was going to be preaching in the Celtic evening service one night. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm home. I've always wanted to hear him preach. I really want to go, in part because for years, people have been telling me when I would lead events, someone would always come up to me with a book by John Philip Newell afterwards and say, have you ever read anything by John Philip Newell? Some things you say remind me of John Philip Newell. And I just wonder if you read this book. And I said, yeah, actually I have read that book. I really like his stuff too. So I see that John Philip's going to be down here at St. Stephen's. This is 2015, 2016. And I was going to be in Virginia. So on a lark, I got John Philip's email from my editor, and I sent him an email, and I said, you don't know me. I'm a writer in America, and I'm a big fan. And I happen to live in Alexandria, Virginia, which is only 75 or however many miles it is from Richmond. And I saw you were going to be at St. Stephen's. Would you like to meet up after your event? And so within a half an hour, he got back to me. And if that person is here from St. Stephen's, you know that does not happen. He is very bad about answering his emails. And so, but he wrote back really fast. And the email was, oh my gosh, I know exactly who you are. Every time I'm in America, somebody comes up to me with one of your books and says, oh my gosh, your writing so reminds me of Diana Butler Bass's. Do you know her? And so he said, I'd be delighted to get together. Well, we planned to have dinner. It was John Philip. It was Gary Jones, the former rector of St. Stephen's, my husband and I, Gary's wife, somebody else, 2 people from the congregation. And we met up at this restaurant not very far away from the church, and we were having just a lovely conversation. And so in the course of the conversation, I said to John Philip, I forgot to mention this. Richard and I are going to be in Scotland next month, and we have 3 empty days on our itinerary. And I was thinking about going to this little parish kirk that I've discovered my ancestor, this guy named Andrew Orme, came from. And I told him about the birth certificate, and he said, and I kind of want to, I want to go there, but I don't know if it's worthwhile because I can't find it on the internet. I think maybe it's a parish that has maybe 5 or 6 people left in it. It doesn't seem to be very well populated. And so he said, well, what's the name of the parish? And I said, and this is my mistake, but I said, the parish is called Monarchy. And he looked at me and he said, oh, in Gaelic, that's Maniki. And I said, oh, okay, well, he's from the parish church of Maniki. And at that point, John Philip just looked at me, and he didn't answer with this eerie kind of quiet. And I said, "You know it?" And he said, "That's where my family is from." And at that point, I will never forget the look on Gary Jones' face. Because he looked across the table and he said, "What did they just say?" And my husband Richard said, "I think they just discovered they're related." And lo and behold, both of us, our ancestral roots are in that same parish church, which is now basically a dead parish. I think that it is still alive, but it's a yoked thing in the Church of Scotland. And our family roots there go back to about 1300. I mean, like, this whole thing about this meeting house in Easton, Maryland, it's like a Twilight Zone episode. I mean, and it just keeps pulling back these layers of time and space and relationality and connection that I just had no idea that my life existed in this web of meaning that is so rich and so profound. And so the reason I love sharing that is because, guess what? Every one of your lives has a similar kind of web of meaning. It's just we don't always discover all of the threads. And that's part of my joy and love of history, is trying to pull on the threads and finding what comes up. Yeah. Oh, these are some of my favorite questions ever.
First, I agree with you on the math.
You really shouldn't make a joke like that while I'm drinking water.
I was struck by the similarities in what you were saying about history and my area of science and biology.
Oh.
And the one thing that I either I missed it or it didn't come out clear, but one of the things in science study, or particularly biology, that I'm more familiar with, is that what is the truth at one point in time is not a lie, it's the truth based upon the information at that point.
Right.
Then something new is discovered, like you discovered more about ancestry, that changes the truth. But what was before that wasn't necessarily a lie.
Right.
It was simply a lack of information.
Yeah, that's one of the things, of course, historians work with all the time, is how we navigate that set of issues. Recently, actually, the president of the American Historical Association got in some pretty big trouble for what some of his colleagues thought was overemphasizing the sort of antiquarian aspects of past knowledge without adjustment to newer discoveries. And yeah, because when you are studying the past, one of the things, of course, you really try to do is you have to be faithful to the people of the past in understanding their worldview. You don't walk right into the past and say, "Oh, you people were all idiots because of X, Y, Z." Because what's going to happen is somebody will walk into our time from the future and say, "Oh, you people are all idiots because of X, Y, Z." So this is the way that history works. So you do enter history with a degree of empathy towards the historical subjects and try to understand how they saw what they saw and why they made the choices they made. And then you can move toward new data and judgment of their choices as well. And so that's where it gets a little more controversial. But historians really do think about that a lot, and many of our arguments are around that very subject. As I know scientists, fight about how new data or new findings, clarifications of theories, all that kind of stuff changes the trajectory of science. So anyway, thanks. That's a really good comparison. I'm sorry I didn't say it more clearly.
For being here. Thank you for being here today. We have been delighted to be in the presence of Diana Butler Bass all day here at River Road Church, and we thank you for coming and being part of this lecture.